Here at Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give many of the talks. We have a planning meeting that's open every quarter, that's open to the whole community, where we brainstorm ideas for talks we'd like to hear and give. Then we vote on the ideas. So today we have our member Michael, who's going to be giving a talk on intuition, tradition, and common sense compared to science. Afterwards, we'll have a discussion. So I'm going to give the floor to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much. When we're born, we're thrown into the world, literally. We're thrown out of our mother's body. And eventually we have to learn how to deal with that world. And we have certain things that we can use to deal with that world. One of them is our instincts, the kind of behaviors that we're born with, or almost born with. For example, learning how to walk. Most of that's pre-programmed at birth to occur when you're 1.5, 2 years old. And but the learning plays an important part. You have to have the learning part into it, but it doesn't take much learning. Now, another tool we have to try and understand our place in the world is common sense. This is the opinions. This is the opinions we share with others, and we have our intuition, which is well, you could call it, rather than using a classical definition, we can look at Kahneman's definition. He talks about slow difference and slow thinking and fast thinking. Well, the fast thinking is we do without much reflection. It comes to us quickly right away. Gut feeling is another word for it. Common sense, we're looking at the opinions of others, and that's sort of the common sense is a correction, or can be a correction, on the instinctive behavior. So if you take, for example, the example we can use here is the development of new theories of nutrition, where it starts. Well, with the hunter and gatherer, you have the taste. If it doesn't taste good, you spit it out. So that's pretty useful information. But it only goes so far. And a lot of people die trying to sort out which plants and animals are poisonous and which are not. So we have to overcome that limitation of our reflexive behavior, our intuition. We have common sense, which is develops living together in a community, living together in a family over time, and that helps. That corrects the intuition sometimes. Sometimes the common sense goes against our intuition, and we end up with Freud's problems, where your intuition is telling you one thing and you're trying to correct it, and you're overcorrecting it, or you're getting in trouble when you correct it. And then another thing we can rely on is tradition. When you have established communities over periods of time, they develop long-term traditions, which can also be informative, can be helpful. Or again, you can run into the same problems that Freud talks about. But so these things act as correction on each other. Now, part of the tradition is science. Now, science is based on an attempt to describe nature using prediction and control to test our propositions, to test our description of nature. well, the value of science is that it's more reliable. So in developed nutrition, for example, we can do a much better job of finding out, of isolating poisons and so on, and we do a somewhat mixed job of identifying what foods are healthy and what foods are not. We know that corn syrup is unhealthy. We know that getting enough protein is necessary, B vitamins for the B vitamins, etc. So the science serves as a correction on the on tradition and on the intuition. It serves, and the main way it serves, it improves on them is that it gives much greater reliability when it's done, when it's finished. A scientific hypothesis is not very reliable, but the finished product is much more reliable usually than tradition or common sense. A good example is the development is the application of biology to medicine, to diseases. Now, the science is interested in getting the best description of how the human body works, and physiology works, and so on. And the engineering discipline is geared on the single, at its extreme, it's geared on the single, the single person right in front of you. And in order to deal with that, you might use advice from the sciences. Let's say the person has a stomach ache, complains of pains in the stomach. Well, you can use advice on what to check for from your science. But if that's not enough, you have to still use your common sense, your experiences in your practice, and so on. You bring all of these things together to cure the particular individuals who's in front of you. So that's the difference between the science and the engineering discipline. And that's where science fits in. The science fits in as a source of reliable advice. Now, the problem with it is, the problem is that getting this science is very expensive, very time consuming. So it doesn't cover a lot. For example, in medicine, we took a long time to deal with smoking. And I remember when I was much younger, I used to go jogging, and I was on the staff of on the local hospital at the time. And when people saw me jogging, they complained about this crazy American, this was in Canada, about this crazy American running through the main streets. And they referred me to the cardiologist on the hospital staff, a colleague of mine. And he assured me that that jogging was all nonsense, and smoking, there was nothing wrong with smoking, and there was no evidence, there was no solid evidence about eating fatty foods or whatever. Well, he was a heart surgeon, and he was a good one. He saved people's lives by operating on their heart. But at that time, the evidence wasn't accumulated, and as a consequence, he did not. He was going under the idea, well, if there's no evidence, then it must be all right. But the problem was that just because there's no evidence, it could mean either it's all right or it's not all right. The evidence has to be established. You have to have evidence for each conclusion. Well, he died shortly after our visit, And the other physicians on the staff told me that they did an autopsy on him, and sure enough, he had he died of cholesterol and fatty tissue and so on in the arteries of his, leading it to his heart. So there's a case where you can know a lot, but if you don't, and you could have some science, but the science isn't developed enough to answer a lot of questions. So that a majority of physicists saw nothing wrong with the cigarette smoking earlier on. Some did, but they weren't basing that on hard evidence. And the evidence came out, of course, it was suppressed. It took a while to work its way to the public. So, now the science, like, you can't say the science has been a failure or it's not useful. I mean, after all, 100 years ago, if you had appendicitis, you were dead. I mean, there was nothing they could do about it. Because even if they operated on you, you probably die of the infection. Because they didn't know about infections 120 years ago. Or they didn't know about the bacterial, the way to use antibiotics to control infections. So we've come a long way. Nowadays, you have appendicitis and you have over a 90% chance that you'll survive. And that's entirely due to the science that's developed since then. And this is not only true for appendicitis, it's true for medicine in general. After all, for thousands of years, the average life expectancy of a human being was about 40 years old, even up until 1880, 1890, was still 40 years old. But then now it's 80 years old, it's been doubled. And the doubling is entirely due to discoveries on how to prevent these diseases and how to treat accidents. So the science has its use. Now, and you can also see this in psychology. Now, psychology is a much newer science. Medicine, I'd say biology got together into a solid science like chemistry in about, with the discovery of DNA and the applications and the use of the discovery of DNA to unify the science. Psychology, I mean, it goes back to Aristotle, but the scientific psychology has made leaps and bounds in the last 30, 40 years. And we're still making leaps and bounds. It's a new science. So we don't really have much that's solidly established. There are some things that are established. For example, the reflex, Sherrington's study of the reflex, Pavlov's study of the conditional responding conditioning, and Skinner's discovery of isolation of operant conditioning. So we have these basic tools, and we have other areas of research, hormones and attachment and so on, which are pretty shaping up pretty well. But we still have a long way to go. I can give you an example of how the operant conditioning was applied to an engineering problem. This took place right here in Seattle. It was a study done by Sidney Bijou at the University of Washington. And what he did was he advertised in the paper for obnoxious for bratty children. And he told us in the advertisements to ask parents to bring their obnoxious children into the university, and they were doing research to cure the brattiness. So when the children arrived at the university, they went into a room. The experimenter sat on the other side of a one-way mirror looking into the room. And they would notice, or they would get a baseline of the child's party behavior. Now, different children had different party behaviors. So they just picked a few that were outstanding. And then they allowed the mother to interact with the child, and they got a baseline. They saw how frequently the behaviors occurred. And in this situation, since it was boring for the child, the party behaviors occurred quite frequently. Then on the second phase of the experiment, the experimenter would hold up his hand like a stop sign, like he's saying stop, and the parent was supposed to positively reinforce the child for the behavior, and pulled up a fist, and the child was she was supposed to ignore the child's behavior. Well, in one phase, in the first phase is when they just got the baseline, what the mother was doing without any signals. Then they introduced the signals, and the behavior quickly changed over a few hours, a few sessions. I mean, it took longer. There were individual differences. It took longer for some children than for others, and so on. But they were able to get all the children to reduce their behavior quite a bit. Then they would do another phase, which they wouldn't do anymore. They wouldn't get it past the ethics committee, I suppose. But the next phase was reinforcing the obnoxious behavior, giving signals to the parent to reinforce the obnoxious behavior and to ignore the positive behavior. And you get a reversal right within the hour. The behaviors would reverse so sharply. And then they could reverse it again, asking the parent to giving the parent signals to reinforce the positive behavior and extinguish the unpleasant behavior. So now this works in an isolated situation where you have the parents and you have the child, a parent alone with the child in a room. When you went to the classroom, it was generalized to the classroom, and it worked, but not quite as well, because sometimes the children were being reinforced by the other children in the class, not by the teacher. It wasn't the teacher attending to an obnoxious behavior without realizing it. It was also the other children in the classroom. So if you changed what the teacher was doing and you didn't change what the other students were doing, you'd still have the behavior. You had to figure out a system that worked on both. And once you reduce both behaviors, then you got the results. And the point is that the major point is that you build up a science. You start with the simple things like when the parent and the child or the rat in the Skinner box, and you start adding in other variables as you go, until you could deal with more and more complex situations. Does anybody have questions?
Yeah. Oh, hey, Michael, thank you. Can everyone unmute for a moment and give Michael a round of applause?